Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's all Star Trek films are ranked. In this video I will rank all the 13 present Star Trek films that exist from my least favorite to my favorite. So this video is it's like the conclusion of my reviewing every single Star Trek film. So I have reviewed every Star Trek film, and this video is sort of an appendix to that. So I'm not going to get in too much detail on what I think about each film or what each film is about, because I already talked about that in my review for each film, which I am assuming that you have seen, but in case you haven't, I'll leave a link to the playlist in the description below if you want more of my thoughts on a particular film or whatever. You should check out my review for that film. This I'm just going to go really quickly as a way of wrapping up my coverage of all the Star Trek films, of how I would rank the films in order from worst to best. And if you have watched my reviews, you probably have a pretty strong idea of how I'm going to rank them. And if you haven't, you might not know this, but I should give a warning that the order I put them in, a lot of people are going to disagree with. It is not the typical ranking that most Trekkers or Star Trek fans or even film fans would put them in, because most people would have like Nemesis and Into Darkness and Insurrection and Final Frontier at the bottom, and have like First Contact, Star Trek 2009, and Star Trek 2 at the top, and like things like Star Trek 3 somewhere in the middle, and Star Trek the Motion Picture somewhere in the middle. And if you watch my reviews, you know that's not going to be the case with me at all. So I should give just a fair warning for that. Anyway, I want to get into naming, just jump right into naming my rankings. But I'm not, usually when I do like top 10 videos and stuff, I will like take the time to talk about each entry, but as I said, I'm not going to do that in this video, so I'm just going to run right through my rankings without stopping, and I'll have a little number up in the corner of the ranking, and it will be color-coded. Ooh, color-code, isn't that fun? So, just to show the degrees in which I like or dislike these films. So I'll separate them into three categories. Red is for the films I think are bad, so the bad films. Blue is for the films I think are good, but maybe not great, but they're good. And then green is for the films that are great, that are awesome, that I absolutely love. So there will be color-coded, so you can check out the little number, the color, that's what it means. Alright, so let's jump right into the rankings. My number 13 is The Final Frontier. Number 12 is 2009. Number 11 is The Motion Picture. Number 10 is Insurrection. Number 9 is First Contact. Number 8 is Into Darkness. Number 7, Generations. Number 6, Beyond. Number 5, Nemesis. Number 4, The Undiscovered Country. Number 3, The Voyage Home. Number 2, The Search for Spock. And number 1, The Wrath of Khan. So that's my rankings. So now let me take a brief time out to talk about my rankings and how they might vary from popular opinion. As you might know, some huge disparity there between myself and popular opinion. First of all, let's get into the bad. Final Frontier being at the bottom is that's pretty agreed upon. That's not going to be seen as out there. Although I have heard the opinion that The Final Frontier is so bad that it's good and therefore it's not the worst Star Trek film. I respectfully disagree. I hate watching. I've watched that film too many times in my life just because it has the name Star Trek and I have to review it or whatever and part of a marathon. And I never want to see that piece of shit again. I don't take any enjoyment out of watching it. I don't think it's so bad it's good. It's just bad. So I think it's, by any measurable measure, like production value, acting, script writing in particular, any measure you can think of, it is by far the worst out there. And right behind it is 2009, which may surprise some people if you haven't seen my videos. If you saw my review on it, you shouldn't be surprised at all. In fact, if you watch my channel at all, because I constantly bash that film, and I know a lot of people will disagree, even those who hate the reboots, like pure Trekkiers like myself, who don't like the reboots, most of them would put Into Darkness beneath it and say, oh yeah, 2009 was okay, but if you notice, I put Into Darkness and Beyond, which I'll get to later, much higher, because 2009 to me, that is the worst. That is such, and I call 2009 even though it's called Star Trek, and again, that's very arrogant of the filmmakers to say, oh, let's just call it Star Trek. And it's not Star Trek. It's the most ironically named title, and it's just a poorly written plot. If you hadn't seen my review, I did a sort of parallel universe version where what I would think about this film if it had nothing to do with Star Trek and it was just an original piece. And even then, I didn't hate it quite as much, but even then I still didn't like it because there's a lot of inherent problems with the script. The character stories suck. The villain's awful. Anyway, enough of that. So shouldn't be surprised that is my second least. In fact, some people might expect me to put it at the absolute bottom, which it was a close contender to. But, again, The Final Frontier, nothing can be worse than that. The motion pictures, the next worst. I know a lot of people will disagree. It's gotten a bit trendy to really like that film. I talked about how it had a lot of production value problems in it, and it absolutely shows the director did not understand Star Trek, kind of similar to the 2009 thing, where he thought he wanted to just do a 2001 Space Odyssey type trippy film, and it's boring. It is not artsy, it's not wow, it's just boring. Anyway, so that's, and then Insurrection, that's pretty well agreed upon. I think most people would have it perhaps lower than I did, but it's still in the sort of bad ranking, as you could see. And then here's where a lot of people are going to disagree. I have First Contact as number 9. Now, if you watch the rating, this is where it changes from bad to good. So I do think there's a huge disparity between Insurrection and First Contact. I do think First Contact is much better. But I had Into Darkness and Generations higher than First Contact. Not to mention Nemesis, but I'll get to that later. I know a lot of people are going to be steamed at that. How dare you? But to be fair, the First Contact, Generations, and Into Darkness, those are all very close calls for me. I could have gone either way with these three. It's almost like a three-way tie. They're all 7s. If you watch my review, I gave them all 7 out of 10. So they're all they're similar to me. So it was hard to sort of separate them out. I know, which most people would be like, oh, it's easy, First Contact's a billion times better than those pieces of crap. But I think Generations and Into Darkness get a lot more hate than they deserve, and First Contact is overrated. It gets a lot more love than it deserves. Again, you watch my review, you see that the First Contact had a lot of structural issues. It didn't have a first act, and it was kind of just a collection of action sequences, but it did have that Picard Drew's character storyline, which really did work, which is why I put it in a good category. But the structural issues, to me, is what slightly gets it below Into Darkness and Generations. Now, as far as Into Darkness and Generations goes, I like them kind of both the same. I probably gave Generations a slight edge because it's not a reboot. And it's actually Star Trek, where Into Darkness isn't really Star Trek. But I'm kind of just judging it as a film on its own. As a film on its own, as I said, Benedict Cumberbatch is great in that film, and it has a really good character story with Kirk and Spock, but has a lot of logical issues in the script as well, but they're not as bad as I think a lot of people make them out to be, and I don't think it is this huge insult to Star Trek, at least not as much as 2009 is. Fuck that film. Anyway, so beyond at number 6, I know a lot of people would disagree with that as well, because again, it's a reboot. How dare you put a reboot that high? And I've heard the opinion, even some people who like some of the reboots think this is the worst one. Although I would say that's a minority opinion. I think most people tend to agree with me that this was the only reboot that felt like Star Trek. I just reviewed this yesterday, of course, and I talked about there's a lot of positives in this film that I really like. So, to me, like, this is like the main drawback of the film was the villain. If it wasn't for the villain, this actually might make it into my top 3, reboot or not, to be perfectly honest. But if it had actually a good villain, the villain was flat, and the revelation at the end of the film about the villain was stupid. But other than that, the film was great. It had great character stories, great action sequences I was actually involved with. It felt true to the themes of Star Trek. It felt like Star Trek. So I actually love, and screw you, I like the Beastie Boys sequence. I love it. I think it actually worked and it wasn't untrue to Star Trek. So, and again, I probably, like, Beyond and Nemesis were, again, neck and neck to me, but I gave Nemesis the slight edge because it's not a reboot. Again, that's sort of the yardstick I'm going by. And Nemesis, of course, most people will tell you is one of the worst. Some people will say it is the worst Star Trek film. They say it's by far the worst Next Generation film. For me, it is very easily the best Next Generation film by far and away. It has issues, and when I did my review, I talked about the issues it has. The Jeep chase scene, unnecessary mental rape scenes, and like trying to sex up Troy and Riker, and the whole thing with Riker fighting that Viceroy guy is a waste of time. And of course, they copied Spock's death from Wrath of Khan. So it does have issues, and that's why it's not higher. Because at one stage in my life, I actually had this as number 2 behind Wrath of Khan, but I had to acknowledge I was sort of blinding myself from the flaws. If I acknowledge the flaws, it's not that high, but I think the positives still outweigh the flaws, and the positives it has one of the best villains, maybe behind Khan. So the second best villain of the Star Trek films, Shinzon, who I loved. I loved Tom Hardy. Just seeing the scenes with Patrick Stewart and Tom Hardy together were pure gold, and it has the best, hands down, best space battle in all of Star Trek, not just the Star Trek movies. The entire Star Trek franchise, that space battle at the end was beautiful, and the whole ensemble, like Next Generation cast, is the only film, maybe other than Generations, that actually gave service to the ensemble Next Generation cast, and the Picard and Data relationship and their character growth were awesome. So I actually think, to me, this puts it as the top 5. And then we get to my top 4, and this is where I reserve the awesomeness for. Notice I didn't give Nemesis an awesome rating because it does have slightly too many flaws, but I did give The Undiscovered Country an awesome rating, which might surprise people because if you watch my reviews, I gave The Undiscovered Country an 8 out of 10, which is the exact same rating I gave to Nemesis, and yet I separate them from just good to awesome. And also, I was a bit critical of The Undiscovered Country. Maybe some people, a lot of Trekkies would put this as their number 2 and up at the top 3 and say it's one of the best. I don't think it's that great. I got kind of bored with the prison Rorpinthe stuff, to be perfectly honest. I thought the middle dragged a bit, which was the big downside for me. But I think I would still put this above in the awesome category rather than Nemesis, because as I said, Nemesis had a lot of issues where this film didn't. It was just a little bit of boring in the middle, which isn't that egregious of an issue. I think the political intrigue aspect, and again, the villain had an amazing villain with Chang, because I loved how he wasn't out for revenge. It was more of he respected Kirk but had a political disagreement. That is so classic Trek, and the way they played that out worked really well. So that was enough for me to put this in the awesome category. Also, you might notice that all 4 films I had in the awesome category were the original series films. Like, all the good ones are my top 4. Like, because, Motion Picture and Final Frontier sucked there at the bottom. But the rest of the original series, the actually good ones, they comprise the top 4 of my list. So, if you know my channel, I'm more of a Next Generation fan than I am an original series fan. I'm not a TOS guy. But I made the opinion before that I actually liked the original series films better than the original series itself. I thought, unlike The Next Generation, which was better suited to a TV format, and the films didn't really work, and that had a lot to do with Rick Berman and studio interference and stuff like that. But Next Generation was still better suited to television, where I actually think the original series kind of works better as films, to be perfectly honest. I love the so my top 3 is the Genesis trilogy, basically, although it's in slightly different order. It's in reverse order, actually. It goes from the last to the first. So Voyage Home, so it was, Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, and Voyage Home. That makes up what I refer to as the Genesis trilogy. Some people call it different things. I think Harv Bennett said, "Oh, this isn't a trilogy." Oh, it is a trilogy. It most certainly is, and it's one of my favorite trilogies. When I did a video of my top 10 film trilogies, this was like my number 3 behind the Star Wars original trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which were both awesome. And I hold it in that high of esteem, that high of regard. It's right up there with the original Star Wars trilogy in my mind. It's like really only slightly behind it. So that's how high I hold these films in regard. And so it's obvious to me it would be in my top 3. The Voyage Home, a few years ago, if like a decade ago, you would have asked me, I would have had Voyage Home a lot lower and would have said, because I felt it was really overrated because it's just a comedy. But once I got over that fact, and also it was the whales, because there's a lot of MacGuffins in this film. It's a lot of plot convenience, just it's a bit contrived, some of the story writing, but it's got the best sort of character ensemble, character interactions of any Star Trek film, and the humor, of course. It's a classic 80s comedy in its own right. So I've gone to appreciate this film a lot more, which is why it's my number 3. Search for Spock being my number 2, a lot of people would disagree with. A lot of people don't like it. As I mentioned at the start of the video, most people would put it sort of in the middle, where it's not that great, but not that bad. I disagree. I always loved Search for Spock. Always one of my favorite Star Trek films. Definitely would come in at number 2 because I thought it was a very good follow-up to The Wrath of Khan. Now, me putting The Wrath of Khan at number 1, that's probably the part of my list that is the least controversial. I mean, that's almost... I rarely come across any trackers who don't put this movie at number 1. And see, I think this kind of proves, like some people might say, accuse me of being a hipster contrarian for having like 2009 at the bottom and Nemesis towards the top and First Contact sort of towards the bottom. Might be like, oh, you're just trying to be hipster contrarian, be different than everyone else. No, I just have my opinion and I stick to it regardless. If it doesn't match up with popular opinion, I don't change my opinion to match up with popular opinion. I'm not trying to be different. I just have my judge things on its own merit and not what other people say. And so that's why, if I was trying to be hipster contrarian, I would have put Wrath of Khan. Wouldn't be my number 1 because everyone has that at their number 1. So I wanted to be contrarian, so I would put it at the bottom so I wouldn't be like everyone else. But I'm not a contrarian, and I do acknowledge and agree with the popular opinion in certain cases, such as this one, where I think it's very obvious that Wrath of Khan is the best Star Trek film and most classic one. Anyway, that is it for my video of ranking all the Star Trek films from my least favorite to my favorite. As I said, I had just done a review for every Star Trek film, which you can check out. Playlist will be linked in the description below. Also, I continue to do lots of videos on Star Trek, like individual episode reviews and whatnot. So you can check out my channel for that. I also cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.